Have you ever wanted to trigger a scenario using multiple different triggers, multiple different pathways to start the same logic? Well, it's not technically possible inside of one scenario in make.com, but there is a workaround. And that workaround leverages webhooks to essentially send data from multiple scenarios into one scenario. One way that you can really simplify your make automations is to compartmentalize what you're doing. Quite often when you're building things in make.com, you'll be reusing the same logic in multiple scenarios. A good example of this is when you're searching for something, creating that thing if it doesn't exist, or updating it if it does exist. Now, this could be in PipeDrive or QuickBooks or Airtable or any sort of CRM database system. Essentially, we're looking up something, we're creating it, then we're setting a variable, or if that thing does exist, then we're updating it to the new values and then setting the ID of that thing that we just updated. That part we might need to do in many different places in our logic. Maybe a contact form gets submitted, then we want to send that contact to our CRM. Or someone submits an opt-in for a lead magnet, we want to send that person to our CRM. Or they book in for a call. Again, we want to send them to our CRM. So this bit of logic can be used in many different scenarios. Now, most people will copy and paste this and put it in multiple scenarios. But the better way to do that is to leverage the multiple trigger method to compartmentalize these chunks in your scenario. So here I'll just copy out these modules and I'll put them in my multi-trigger scenario. Now, when we send data to our webhook, it will then process that data. And in this case, it will look for the email address in PipeDrive, and it will then create that person or update that person. And then it will either have the new person's ID or the existing person's ID. And then we will then return that ID to our webhook. Now, we can use this either without a webhook response. Maybe you've got 5 different contact forms and you just want to funnel them all into the same logic. Anytime a contact is created or updated somewhere, then we want to check our CRM. Well, you could trigger this scenario to run, and all we'd need to send is just the basic contact information, name, email, etc. The second way is that we can set this up to then deliver a response. Now, I'm just going to disable that route there, just to make this a little easier. And our response will just be some simple JSON here. Essentially just want to pass back that ID into the original scenario that I've built so that I can then map that in my next steps. That's exactly what this webhook response does. It sends the response back to the webhook source, so then we can carry on with the rest of the logic in our scenario. So now we can go ahead and we can remove all these fields. The first step here is sending data to our webhook. We could put this at the start of the scenario. We could put this in the middle of the scenario. We could put this at the end, put it anywhere we like in the scenario. And essentially all this does is it sends some data, which we can either enter manually or map from another module. And it sends this data to our webhook. Now, this webhook then captures the data and it instantly resolves that data through this logic, and then it will then send this response. If I'm expecting data to be returned from my HTTP call, then I need to use a get method. And that's because I want to get data from calling this URL, calling this webhook. I can still send data when I do a get request because I'm sending information about what I want to receive back. And so here I'm still sending across my contact information, but now the result of this module is that I get a data bundle with the ID of the person. So what happens here is the data is received by my webhook. I've got my name and I've got my email. Then it runs the data through PipeDrive. And I've got this disabled just so I don't have to map this. So it would then look up the email in PipeDrive. It then creates the person if the email doesn't exist, stores their ID here in the variable. Then if the person does exist, it just simply updates the person with the new details that have been received and stores the existing ID in the variable. Now, once these two paths have been taken, then it will take the second path here and it will get the variable that we stored above, which is the person ID, and then we return that with our webhook response. Now, you could, if you want, get rid of these get and set variables and just put the webhook response at the end of these create and updates. But I prefer just to sort of build it this way. It's just a little bit neater because I might want to do additional logic with this person before I send them across to my webhook. For instance, I might also have an active campaign step in here where I look the email up, create them, and I want to also return the active campaign ID in the same webhook response. And that's important because you can only send one webhook response for your webhook. You can't send multiple. The benefit here is that we don't ever have to rebuild this logic. Now, whenever we need to create or update a person, we just call this one scenario. And as long as we send in the data in the correct format, then this scenario can then run and do its logic, and it will always return a person ID. It will either create or update that person that we tell it. If we don't need a webhook response, then we can simply start the scenario by sending the same webhook. But in this instance, we would want to send the webhook with just a post request because we're just posting information out to the scenario, and then that scenario will independently run the logic, and we're not waiting for anything to be returned to then finish the logic in the first scenario that we're running. Now, something extremely important with this webhook response is we have to set the content type of the data that we're sending back to our HTTP module. If we don't set the content type, well, then our HTTP module has no idea what we've actually sent it. So this bit here with the custom header, which you can turn on and off with the advanced settings, you have to set it to content type application/JSON. And that way, when this data gets sent across, then the HTTP module can then read that it is JSON data and parse it correctly. You could also send across text data, and then you would just send, for instance, a number, and then that would get read correctly in this system as well, as long as you declared what that content type was that you're sending across.